There has never been a moment in the history of the Imperium when it was not eating its children. Not metaphorically, not poetically. The Imperium of Man is a system that consumes human lives at a rate that makes genocide look like arithmetic. It does this not because it is evil, but because it is functional. The Great Crusade was not an exception to this principle. It was the moment when the principle became universal law. What follows is not a story of glory. It is an explanation of how the machine was built, how it was fed, and why it cannot stop. Before there were heroes, there were quotas. The Great Crusade, as it would come to be known, began not with a declaration, but with a series of administrative reforms across the fragmentary proto-imperium of the 30th millennium. Terra had been unified, Mars had been brought into alliance. The Astronomicon, a psychic lighthouse burning in the warp, had been lit using a choir of 10,000 psychers whose lives would be measured in weeks, not years. The Astronomicon was not a miracle. It was infrastructure. Its function was simple, to create a navigable corridor through the immaterium, allowing void ships to traverse distances that would otherwise require centuries of real space travel. Without it, no ship could reliably cross the gulfs between stars. With it, the speed of travel increased by orders of magnitude. This made expansion possible. It also made the Astronomicon the single most critical piece of infrastructure in human space. The psychers who powered it were called the Chosen. This was a euphemism. They were fuel. Bound into the machinery beneath the imperial palace on Terra, their minds were linked and their souls burned to generate the beacon. Each psyker would last between 6 and 9 weeks before their consciousness collapsed and their body became ash. The system required a constant flow of replacements. This created the first quota. 10,000 psychers consumed every 2 months meant an annual demand of approximately 60,000 individuals with sufficient psychic resonance to survive the binding process, even briefly. These individuals had to be identified, collected, transported to Terra, and processed. Most would die in transit. Most of the survivors would die during the binding. The system accounted for this. The quota was not 10,000. It was 10,000 survivors. To meet this demand, the black ships were commissioned. The black ships were not warships. They were transports, heavily shielded against both physical and psychic assault, crewed by personnel who understood that their cargo was more dangerous than any weapon. Each ship could carry approximately 5,000 psychers in containment. Each voyage from the outer reaches of compliant human space to Terra took between 4 and 18 months, depending on warp conditions. Mortality rates during transport averaged 40%. The mathematics were simple. To deliver 60,000 viable psychers per year, the black ships had to collect at least 100,000. To collect 100,000, they had to identify and extract them from a population of billions. This required the second system, the tithe. Every world that entered compliance with the Imperium was assigned a tithe grade. The grade determined what the world would provide. Hive worlds provided guardsmen, Forge worlds provided material, Agri worlds provided food, and every world, regardless of its primary output, provided psychers. The tithe was not negotiable. It was not adjusted for hardship. It was a function of population and productivity, calculated by administrative officials who would never see the worlds they governed. If a world failed to meet its tithe, it was marked for investigation. If the investigation found willful noncompliance, the world was marked for sanction. Sanctions ranged from economic penalties to orbital bombardment. The system did not require cruelty. It required consistency. The psychers collected by the tithe were not volunteers. They were identified by local authorities, planetary governors, ecclesiarchy priests, PDF officers, and detained. Families were not consulted. In many cases, families were not informed. The disappeared were logged, their names entered into data slates that would be transmitted to the black ships when they arrived in system. Most of these individuals were children. Psychic potential manifests early, usually before the age of 15. The Imperium preferred to collect psychers young, before their abilities could fully develop and before they could become dangerous. A trained psycher could resist capture. A child could not. The logic was sound. The result was that the black ships carried children in their holds, shackled and sedated for months at a time. This was not an atrocity, it was policy. The third system was the iterators. While the black ships collected psychers and the administratum calculated tithes, the iterators were deployed to newly compliant worlds to explain why compliance was necessary. They were not soldiers. They were orators, philosophers, propagandists. Their role was to translate the ideology of the Imperium, rationalism, unity, the imperial truth, into terms that local populations could accept. The imperial truth stated that there were no gods. That superstition was the enemy of progress. That humanity's survival depended on the eradication of religion and the embrace of reason. This was the official doctrine of the Great Crusade, and the iterators were its messengers. They spoke in amphitheaters, on Vox networks, in town squares. They explained that the emperor was not divine, that the Mechanicum's worship of the Omnissiah was a temporary political concession, that the warp was a natural phenomenon, not a realm of demons. They explained this to populations who had spent millennia worshipping spirits, ancestors, planetary deities, or worse. The iterators were very good at their job. They were also entirely sincere. Most of them believed what they said. The fourth system was the Legiones Astartes. The Space Marines were not the largest military force of the Great Crusade. That distinction belonged to the Imperial Army, the conventional human military force that numbered in the billions. But the Legiones Astartes were the most visible, the most effective, and the most symbolic. They were post-human warriors, genetically engineered and psychologically conditioned to be superior to baseline humanity in every measurable way. Each legion was built around the genetic template of a Primarch, a being created by the Emperor through means that were never fully explained and never recorded. The Primarchs were generals, warlords, administrators, philosophers. They were also weapons. Each commanded between 10,000 and 250,000 Space Marines, depending on the legion and the period of the Crusade. The creation of a Space Marine required a human aspirant, usually between the ages of 10 and 14. The aspirant would undergo surgical implantation of 19 gene seed organs, each of which would alter their physiology in specific ways. The process took years. The survival rate was approximately 30%. This meant that to create one Space Marine, the legions required 3 aspirants. To maintain a legion of 100,000 Space Marines over the course of a 200-year crusade, accounting for combat losses, genetic rejection, and attrition, the legions required a constant supply of aspirants. Millions of them. These aspirants were not volunteers. They were selected. The criteria varied by legion. Some selected for aggression, some for intelligence, some for endurance. The word-bearers selected for faith. The Knight Lords selected for fear. The selection process was brutal because the legions believed it had to be. Only the best could survive the transformation. Anyone less than the best was waste. The bodies of failed aspirants were disposed of without ceremony. Their names were not recorded. They had no families to mourn them, because the legions took aspirants young enough that family bonds could be severed without psychological damage. This was not cruelty. It was efficiency. The fifth system was the Mechanicum. Mars had been brought into alliance with Terra through the Treaty of Olympus, a political arrangement that granted the Mechanicum autonomy in exchange for material support. The Mechanicum controlled the forges. The forges produced everything the Crusade required: void ships, weapons, armor, vehicles, augmetics, servitors. Servitors were humans who had been lobotomized and cybernetically augmented to perform specific tasks. They were used as living machinery in environments too dangerous or too complex for standard automata. A servitor had no will, no memory, no personality. It performed its function until it broke, at which point it was discarded and replaced. The Mechanicum did not create servitors from volunteers. They created them from criminals, from the brain-damaged, from the poor, and when supply was insufficient, from anyone the local authorities deemed expendable. The process was irreversible. The person who entered the conversion chamber did not leave. What emerged was a thing. The Mechanicum did not consider this unethical. They considered it practical. Flesh was weak, but it could be repurposed. A human who could not contribute to society as a laborer or a soldier could still contribute as a servitor. This was seen as merciful. The scale of servitor production during the Great Crusade is unknown, but estimates suggest that billions of individuals were converted. They operated the forges, they crewed the ships, they maintained the Hive Cities. They were the Imperium's workforce, silent and tireless and utterly disposable. These 5 systems, the Astronomicon, the Tithe, the Iterators, the Legiones Astartes, and the Mechanicum, were not separate. They were interlocking, each fed into the others. The Astronomicon allowed the black ships to travel. The Tithe provided psychers for the Astronomicon and aspirants for the legions. The Iterators justified the Tithe. The Mechanicum built the ships that carried the Iterators. The legions enforced compliance, which expanded the Tithe base, which fed the Astronomicon, which allowed the Crusade to continue. This was not a war machine. It was a perpetual motion machine, powered by human lives. And it worked. His name was Varon Thes, and he was a Tithe Assessor 3rd class assigned to the Administratum Orbital Station above the world of Kellia Primus. Kellia Primus was a hive world. Population, 14 billion. Primary output, infantry conscripts and mid-grade industrial components. Tithe grade, exactus extremis, meaning the world was required to meet its quota precisely, with no margin for shortfall. Varon's job was to ensure that the quota was met. He had been doing this job for 6 years. Varon was 31 years old. He had been born on a different hive world, raised in a Scala facility, trained in administrative procedure, and assigned to the Departamento Exacta at the age of 20. He had never questioned this. The Imperium needed assessors. He was capable of performing the role. Therefore, he performed it. His duties were simple. Every 6 months, Kellia Primus was required to deliver a tithe of 300,000 guardsmen, 5,000 psychers, and 200,000 tons of industrial output. Varon's task was to verify that the tithe had been collected, inspect the quality of the delivered goods, and transmit a certification to the sector administratum. If the tithe was complete and met minimum quality standards, he certified it. If it did not, he reported the discrepancy. He had never reported a discrepancy. Kellia Primus always met its quota. Varon worked in a small office on the orbital station, a rectangular chamber with gray walls and a single viewport that looked down at the planet below. The viewport was not decorative. It was functional. If the manufactories on the surface stopped producing, Varon would see the change in atmospheric light scattering. If the Hive Cities went dark, he would know before the Vox reports arrived. He did not look out the viewport often. There was no need. His days followed a rhythm. He woke at 6 station time. He ate a ration bar and drank recaf. He walked 17 minutes to his office. He activated his data slate and began processing intake reports. At 12, he ate another ration bar. At 18, he filed his daily summary and returned to his HAB unit. He slept for 7 hours. He repeated this cycle without variation. Varon did not find this monotonous. Monotony implied dissatisfaction, and he was not dissatisfied. The work was necessary. He was performing it adequately. That was sufficient. On the morning of the 143rd day of the Imperial year 006 M31, Varon arrived at his office and found a message waiting on his data slate. It was a requisition amendment from the Departamento Militarum. The message informed him that the psyker tithe for Kellia Primus had been increased from 5,000 to 7,000, effective immediately. The increase was due to elevated demand following the loss of 3 black ships in the Ghoul Stars. The shortfall needed to be compensated. The message did not ask for confirmation. It stated the new quota and provided a deadline, the next tithe collection in 43 days. Varon read the message twice. Then he opened the planetary compliance file for Kellia Primus and reviewed the psyker collection records from the previous year. Kellia Primus had delivered exactly 5,000 psychers in each of the last 4 tithe cycles. The world's psycher identification rate was stable at approximately 3 per 100,000 population, which was consistent with human baseline averages. To increase the tithe to 7,000, the planetary authorities would need to increase the identification rate by 40%. This was not impossible. It simply required the authorities to expand their search parameters, to detain individuals with marginal psychic resonance, to collect suspects who might have been previously overlooked. Varon calculated the impact. An additional 2,000 psychers extracted from a population of 14 billion represented an increase of 0.000014%. Statistically insignificant, The families affected would number perhaps 10,000 individuals, assuming an average family size of 5. Still insignificant. He composed a transmission to the planetary governor's office, informing them of the updated quota and the deadline. He flagged the transmission as Administratum Priority Secundus, which meant it would be processed within 72 hours. Then he filed the requisition amendment in the active tithe folder and returned to his other duties. He did not think about the message again for 19 days. The transmission reached the office of Governor Halleck Voss on the 145th day. It was processed by a junior scribe named Orvid, who logged it, categorized it, and placed it in the pending queue for the governor's staff to review. The pending queue contained 237 items. Governor Voss was a competent administrator. He had governed Kellia Primus for 12 years, and in that time the world had never failed to meet its tithe. He managed this not through personal attention, but through delegation. He employed a staff of 43 officials, each responsible for a different aspect of planetary governance. The official responsible for tithe compliance was a woman named Seneth Kor. Seneth reviewed the pending queue every 3 days. On the 148th day, she opened Varon's transmission, read it, and immediately flagged it as urgent. 7,000 psychers in 40 days. The current collection rate would yield 5,000, maybe 5,200 if they were fortunate. To collect 7,000, she would need to expand the sweep parameters. This would require coordination with the Adeptus Astartes, the local enforcers, and the ecclesiarchy. It would also require the governor's approval to divert resources. She composed a request for emergency tithe adjustment and submitted it to the governor's office. The request was logged and placed in the approval queue. The approval queue contained 91 items. Governor Voss reviewed the approval queue every 7 days. On the 155th day, he opened Seneth's request and read it carefully. The request outlined the problem, proposed a solution, and estimated the cost. 6,000 man-hours of Arbite's labor, the use of enforcer squads from 3 Hive sectors, and a temporary suspension of certain civil liberty protocols to allow for expanded detainment authority. The governor approved the request. He signed the authorization and transmitted it back to Seneth. The transmission took 2 days to process. By the time Seneth received the approval, it was the 157th day. She had 36 days to collect 2,000 additional psychers. She immediately contacted the local Arbites precinct and requested the deployment of sweep teams. The Arbites commander, a man named Theros Keen, reviewed the request and approved it. He assigned 16 teams, each consisting of 4 Arbites and 2 sanctioned psychers, who would be used to identify latent psychic resonance in detained suspects. The sweeps began on the 159th day. The teams moved through the lower Hive sectors, detaining anyone who triggered the psycher's senses. The criteria were broad: a child who made eye contact too quickly, an adult who flinched at the wrong moment, a laborer who seemed too calm under interrogation. These were not reliable indicators of psychic ability, but reliability was not the priority. Volume was the priority. In the first week, the teams detained 912 individuals. Of these, 260 tested positive for latent psychic resonance. The rest were released. In the second week, the teams detained 1,040 individuals. Of these, 290 tested positive. By the third week, the teams had detained over 3,000 people and identified 718 psychers. It was not enough. Seneth filed a status report with the governor's office, informing him that they were behind schedule. She requested permission to expand the sweep zones to the mid-Hive sectors, where the population was denser and resistance was likely to be stronger. The governor approved the expansion. On the 173rd day, the sweeps moved into the mid-Hive. The teams encountered their first organized resistance on the 175th day, when a group of Hab block residents barricaded a residential tower and refused to allow the Arbites entry. The standoff lasted 4 hours. The Arbites breached the barricade using shock mauls and incapacitators. 17 residents were injured. 3 died. The sweep continued. By the 180th day, the teams had collected 6,400 psychers. They were 43 days into the 43-day deadline. Seneth transmitted the final count to Varon's office on the orbital station. The transmission included a notation: tithe delivered, count 6,400, shortfall 600. Cause: insufficient population density in compliant zones. Recommendation: expand sweep protocols for next cycle. Varon received the transmission on the 181st day. He read it. He noted the shortfall. He opened the compliance guidelines and reviewed the acceptable variants for tithe delivery. The guidelines stated that a shortfall of less than 10% could be approved by a tithe assessor if the planetary authority provided documentation of extenuating circumstances. 600 out of 7,000 was 8.5%, within acceptable variance. Varon reviewed the documentation Seneth had provided. It was thorough. The sweep protocols had been followed. The shortfall was due to factors outside the planetary government's control. He certified the tithe. Then he filed an amendment to the next tithe cycle, increasing the psyker quota to 7,600 to compensate for the shortfall. He did not think about the 17 injured residents or the 3 who had died. They were not part of the tithe. They were not his concern. The 6,400 psychers collected from Kellia Primus were loaded onto a black ship on the 184th day. The ship was called the Unrelenting Duty. It was a Cobra-class transport, retrofitted for high-capacity psychic containment. Its holds could carry 7,000 psychers in detention cells stacked 4 levels deep. The cells were 2 meters by 2 meters. Each cell held 3 psychers. The loading process took 9 hours. The psychers were brought up from the surface in bulk landers, shackled in lines of 50. They were marched through the ship's cargo bay and sorted by age and psychic potency. The children went to the lower holds. The adults went to the upper holds. The violent ones were sedated. Most of them were children. The Unrelenting Duty departed Kellia Primus on the 185th day and entered the warp on the 186th. The voyage to Terra was estimated at 112 days, assuming stable warp conditions. Warp conditions were not stable. On the 33rd day of the voyage, the ship encountered a localized Empyrean disturbance in the Segmentum Solar Approach Corridor. The disturbance was not severe, classified as a Grade 2 turbulence event, but it extended the voyage by 18 days. The ship's Geller field held. The crew did not panic. The psychers in the holds did not know that anything had changed. But the delay had consequences. The psychers were fed once per day. The ship carried sufficient rations for a 112-day voyage with a safety margin of 20 days. The 18-day delay consumed most of the safety margin. On the 120th day of the voyage, the ship's quartermaster filed a report stating that rations would be exhausted in 8 days. The ship's captain, a career voidsman named Herrick Tolle, reviewed the report and issued an order: reduce rations to half portions. The psychers in the holds began to starve. The Unrelenting Duty arrived at Terra on the 134th day of the voyage. By then, 493 psychers had died of malnutrition, dehydration, or complications from prolonged sedation. Their bodies were logged, sealed in containment bags, and jettisoned into low orbit, where they would burn up on re-entry. The surviving psychers, 5,907, were offloaded and transported to the processing facilities beneath the Imperial Palace. There, they underwent medical evaluation, psychic testing, and final categorization. Of the 5,907, 3,400 were deemed suitable for astronomical duty. The rest were categorized as either insufficient, too weak, or excessive, too dangerous. The insufficient were remanded to the Adeptus Astra Telepathica for training as sanctioned psychers or astropaths. The excessive were executed. The 3,400 suitable candidates were bound into the Astronomican Choir in groups of 100 over the course of 34 days. Each binding took 6 hours. Each psycher screamed for the first 3. By the end of the process, all 3,400 were dead. Their lives had been extended just long enough to burn. On Kellia Primus, Seneth Corps received a confirmation notice from the Administratum: tithe certified, next cycle quota updated. She filed the notice and moved on to the next item in her queue. Governor Voss never saw the notice. He was attending a dinner with representatives from the Departamento Munitorum, discussing the deployment of the next guardsman tithe. Varanthes logged the completion of the tithe cycle and began processing intake reports for the next world on his schedule. He did not think about Kellia Primus. He had already certified it. It was no longer his concern. None of them knew how many people had died. None of them asked. Varanthes learned the truth on the 198th day of the year, 006 M31, though he did not recognize it as truth at first. He was reviewing a summary report from the Departamento Exacta, a quarterly analysis of tithe compliance rates across the segmentum. The report was 300 pages long and contained data on 214 worlds. Varon's task was to identify anomalies and recommend corrective actions. On page 147, he found an entry for Kellia Primus. The entry noted that the world had been upgraded from Exactus Extremis to Exactus Particular, a higher tithe grade that required increased output across all categories. The change had been logged on the 190th day, 5 days after Varon had certified the most recent tithe. The reason for the upgrade was listed as sustained compliance and demonstrated capacity for increased production. Varon read the entry 3 times. The upgrade made no sense. Kellia Primus had only barely met the previous tithe. The Psyker shortfall had been within acceptable variance, but it had still been a shortfall. The world had not demonstrated excess capacity. It had demonstrated exactly the capacity required to meet the quota, and no more. And yet it had been upgraded. Varon opened the compliance file and reviewed the historical data. Over the past 6 years, Kellia Primus had met its quota every cycle. It had never exceeded the quota. It had never failed to meet it. It had delivered precisely what was required, every time. And every time it met the quota was increased. He traced the pattern backward. 6 years ago, when he had first been assigned to assess Kellia Primus, the Psyker tithe had been 3,000. 3 years ago, it had been increased to 4,000. 18 months ago, it had been increased to 5,000. 43 days ago, it had been increased to 7,000. In 6 years, the tithe had more than doubled. He checked the population data. The population of Kellia Primus had not increased. It had decreased slightly, from 14 billion to 13,800 million, due to a combination of guardsman conscription and industrial accidents. The world was being asked to provide more with less. Varon opened the files for the other worlds on his assessment schedule. He traced the same pattern. Every world that consistently met its quota was eventually upgraded. Every world that was upgraded was required to provide more. Every increase in the tithe was justified by the fact that the world had met the previous tithe. This was not a mistake. This was policy. The Imperium did not measure a world's capacity by what it could sustainably produce. It measured capacity by what the world had most recently produced. If a world could deliver 5,000 Psykers, then it could deliver 7,000. If it could deliver 7,000, then it could deliver 10,000. There was no ceiling. There was only the quota, and the quota always increased. Varon sat in his office for a long time, looking at the data. He thought about the 3 residents who had died in the barricade breach on Kellia Primus. He thought about the 493 Psykers who had starved on the unrelenting duty. He thought about the 17 injured civilians, the 6,400 children shackled in the holds, the families who had lost sons and daughters to the sweeps. He thought about the fact that none of this had been recorded as a failure. The system had worked exactly as designed. The tithe had been collected. The shortfall had been within acceptable variance. The Astronomicon had been fed. The crusade had continued, and next cycle the quota would be higher. Varanthes closed the file. He logged his review as complete. He did not file a report. There was nothing to report. The system was functioning correctly. He returned to his hab unit that night and did not sleep. He lay on his cot and stared at the ceiling and understood, with a clarity that felt like suffocation, that the Imperium did not care whether Kellia Primus could meet the quota. It cared only that the quota was met. If the world could not meet it, the world would be bled until it could. If the bleeding killed the world, the Imperium would move to the next world and begin again. This was not cruelty. This was not even indifference. This was mathematics. The Imperium needed a certain number of psychers to power the Astronomicon. It needed a certain number of guardsmen to fight its wars. It needed a certain tonnage of industrial output to build its ships. These were fixed requirements. The only variable was which worlds would provide them. If a world could provide more, it would be required to provide more. If it could not, it would be replaced. Varon understood this. He had always understood this. But he realized now that he had believed, that the system was designed to be sustainable, that the quotas were calculated to allow the worlds to recover, that the Imperium took only what could be spared. He had been wrong. The Imperium took everything. It took until there was nothing left to take, and then it moved on. The only reason Kellia Primus still existed was because it had not yet been completely consumed. But it would be. Varon lay on his cot and thought about this until the numbers stopped meaning anything. Then he got up, washed his face, ate a ration bar, and went to work. He never thought about it again. Kellia Primus met its tithe for the next 4 cycles. On the 5th cycle, it failed. The psyker quota had been increased to 8,500. The planetary authorities swept the hives for 6 weeks and collected 7,900. The shortfall was 7%. Within acceptable variance, but not ideal. Varon certified the tithe and filed an amendment increasing the next cycle's quota to 9,000. On the 6th cycle, Kellia Primus delivered 8,200 psychers. Shortfall, 9%. Still within variance, Varon certified the tithe and increased the quota to 9,500. On the 7th cycle, Kellia Primus delivered 7,300 psychers. Shortfall, 23%. Outside acceptable variance, Varon filed a discrepancy report and requested an investigation. The investigation was conducted by an administratum auditor named Hess Volmar. Volmar arrived on Kellia Primus on the 211th day of the year 008 to M31 and spent 3 weeks reviewing the planetary records. His report was filed on the 232nd day. The report concluded that Kellia Primus had been over-tithed. The psyker identification rate had dropped to 0.5 per 100,000 population, well below the human baseline average of 3 per 100,000. The cause of the drop was unclear, but Volmar speculated that it was due to population depletion in the psychically active demographic. In simpler terms, Kellia Primus had run out of psychers. The world's population had not collapsed. 13 billion people still lived in the hives. But the pool of individuals with psychic potential had been exhausted. The sweeps had taken every child with even marginal resonance. There were no more to take. Volmar's report included a recommendation. Reduce the psyker tithe to 2,000 per cycle and allow the population to recover over a period of 10 years. The recommendation was denied. Instead, the Departamento Exacta issued a new directive. Kellia Primus would maintain its current tithe obligations by importing psychers from neighboring systems. The cost of the import would be deducted from the world's industrial output tithe. Governor Vos received the directive and implemented it. Kellia Primus began purchasing psychers from nearby hive worlds, paying in manufactured goods and raw materials. The arrangement was inefficient and expensive, but it allowed the world to meet its quota. For a while. By the year 0110 M31, Kellia Primus could no longer afford the imports. The industrial output tithe had been increased to compensate for sector-wide demand, and there was nothing left to trade. The world requested a reduction in the psyker tithe. The request was denied. On the 304th day of 0N2 M31, Kellia Primus failed to deliver its tithe. The shortfall was 62%. The world was marked for sanction. The sanction was carried out by the Imperial Navy. A single cruiser, the Absolute Certitude, entered orbit on the 318th day and fired a single lance strike into Hive Primus, the world's capital hive. The strike killed an estimated 2 million people and destroyed the primary administratum facility. The purpose of the strike was not to kill, it was to communicate. 3 days later, Governor Vos transmitted a message to the sector administratum pledging full compliance and requesting an extension to deliver the outstanding tithe. The extension was granted. Kellia Primus scraped together the remaining psychers by expanding the sweep parameters to include individuals who had previously been classified as insufficient. children with barely detectable psychic resonance, adults with latent abilities that would never manifest, people who were not psychers at all, but who might be, if the testing equipment was imprecise enough. The tithe was delivered. 2 months later, 94% of the psychers sent from Kellia Primus were rejected by the Astronomican processing facilities as unusable. They were executed. Kellia Primus was not informed. By the year 012.M31, the world could no longer meet its tithe under any circumstances. The population had been depleted. The hives were collapsing. The industrial output had fallen below minimum thresholds. The Administratum reclassified the world as Solutio Tertius, a failing asset. No further sanctions were issued. The world was simply left to collapse on its own. Varanthes was reassigned to a different world before the collapse was complete. He never learned what happened to Kellia Primus. He did not ask. The Great Crusade lasted 204 years, from 798 M30 to 02 M31. In that time, the Imperium brought approximately 1 million worlds into compliance. It is estimated that the total human population under Imperial control increased from several hundred billion to over 1 trillion. The tithe system implemented during the Crusade remained in place after its conclusion. It remains in place to this day. The Astronomican still burns. It has burned for 10,000 years. The psychers who power it are still called the Chosen. They are still fuel. The black ships still travel between the stars, collecting children who will never see their families again. The forges of Mars still convert human beings into servitors. The Legiones Astartes, now calling themselves chapters, still take aspirants and discard the failures. The Administratum still calculates quotas, still increases them, still marks worlds for sanction when they fail. None of this has changed. Kellia Primus is not unique. There are thousands of worlds like it. Worlds that met their quotas until they couldn't. Worlds that were bled until they collapsed. Worlds that exist now only as entries in the Administratum archives, marked as Solutio Tertius or worse. The Imperium does not remember them. It does not mourn them. It records their loss as a variance in supply and adjusts the quotas for the remaining worlds accordingly. This is not a tragedy. This is not a crime. This is the Imperium of Man. It is a machine that consumes people. It has always been a machine that consumes people. The Great Crusade did not create this system. It simply made the system universal. And the system works. The Astronomican still burns. Date 3/11.012M31. Filed by Tithe Assessor, 3rd Class Varanthes Subject. Final Compliance Certification. World Designation Kellia Primus removed from active assessment schedule due to reclassification as Solutio Tertius. All outstanding tithe obligations archived. Station decommissioned effective 3/15/012M31. No further action required. Imperator Volt. While Varanthes was certifying tithes on the orbital station above Kellia Primus, another system was being implemented across the expanding Imperium. This system had no quotas. It had no data slates. It could not be measured in tonnage or head count. It was called the Imperial Truth, and it was a lie. The Imperial Truth stated that there were no gods, that the warp was a natural phenomenon, that humanity's future lay in reason, not superstition. This was the official ideology of the Great Crusade, enforced by the iterators and upheld by the Emperor himself. But the Emperor was worshipped as a god, not officially, not in imperial doctrine, but in practice on 10,000 worlds, in a billion prayers by trillions of people who had been conquered and told to abandon their faiths. The Emperor was prayed to, revered, and treated as divine. The Imperium did not stop this. The reason was simple. Faith was useful. A guardsman who believed the Emperor was watching over him would charge into gunfire. A laborer who believed the Emperor valued his sacrifice would work until his body failed. A mother who believed the Emperor needed her son would surrender him to the black ships without protest. Faith made people compliant. It made them willing. It made them efficient. The iterators spoke against superstition. They gave speeches in amphitheaters explaining that the Emperor was a man, a genius, a unifier, but not a god. They were very convincing. And then the same populations would watch a space marine walk through their streets. A 3-meter-tall post-human warrior who could crush a man's skull with his bare hands, and they would see a living angel. They would watch a fleet of ships descend from the sky, and they would see divine will made manifest. The Imperium told people not to worship. But everything the Imperium did was designed to inspire awe. This was not an accident. The architecture of the Imperium, the cathedrals, the hive spires, the forged temples, the void ships shaped like flying basilicas, was not functional. It was symbolic. A factorum could be built as a rectangular block with optimal thermal efficiency and minimal wasted space. Instead, it was built with 100-meter-tall statues of the Emperor, with Gothic arches, with stained-glass viewports depicting scenes of conquest. This was inefficient. It was also necessary, because the Imperium did not rule through law, it ruled through belief. A guardsman could be ordered to charge into certain death, and he might refuse. But if he believed the Emperor was watching, if he believed his death had meaning, if he believed he would be remembered in the eternal war against darkness, he would charge, he would die, and his death would be useful. The Imperium needed this. It needed people who would obey not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to, because they believed. So the Imperium cultivated faith, even as it officially denied the existence of gods. And the person who understood this better than anyone was a man who would, in time, destroy everything the Crusade had built. His name was Lorgar. Lorgar Aurelian was the Primarch of the Thesepthint Legion, the Word-Bearers. He was a preacher, a philosopher, and a true believer. He believed in the Emperor. He believed with a conviction that made him dangerous. The Word-Bearers were not the largest legion. They were not the fastest or the most brutal, but they were the most thorough. When the Word-Bearers brought a world into compliance, they did not simply conquer it. They converted it. Every temple was torn down and rebuilt as a shrine to the Emperor. Every priest was replaced with an iterator. Every holy text was burned and replaced with scriptures praising the imperial truth. This took time. While other legions conquered dozens of worlds per year, the Word-Bearers conquered fewer than 10. But the worlds they conquered stayed conquered. There were no rebellions, no uprisings. The populations did not resist because they had been taught that resistance was not just futile, it was heresy. Lorgar did not see this as conquest, he saw it as salvation. He believed the Emperor was divine. He said so openly. He wrote it in the texts he distributed to every world the Word-Bearers conquered. He built monuments to the Emperor's glory, statues so large they could be seen from orbit. He preached that humanity's purpose was to serve the Emperor, that the Emperor was the one true God, and that all who denied this were damned. The Emperor hated this. On the 267th day of 0007.M30, the Emperor himself descended to the world of Kur, a planet that the Word-Bearers had spent 6 years converting into a model of perfect faith. The Emperor was accompanied by Robout Gilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines, and a detachment of custodians. The Word-Bearers were assembled in the plaza before the great cathedral they had built. 100,000 Space Marines, kneeling in perfect ranks, waiting for their father's approval. The Emperor did not give it. Instead, he ordered the Ultramarines to destroy the cathedral. The bombardment lasted 6 hours. By the end, the cathedral was rubble. The city surrounding it was ash. The monuments Lorgar had built were dust. The Emperor stood before Lorgar and told him the truth. You are not spreading enlightenment. You are spreading religion. You are spreading weakness. You are wasting time the Imperium does not have. Lorgar wept, and then he obeyed. For the next 2 years, the Word-Bearers fought faster. They conquered more worlds. They stopped building monuments. They stopped writing scripture. They became efficient. But Lorgar did not stop believing. He simply stopped believing in the Emperor. What Lorgar did next is not recorded in official imperial histories. The records were purged, the witnesses silenced, the evidence erased. But the consequences are known. Lorgar went on a pilgrimage. He took a small group of trusted warriors and traveled into the dark spaces beyond the Imperium's borders, into regions where the warp bled into real space, where reality itself was thin. He was searching for truth. He found it. The entities he encountered in those dark places spoke to him. They told him that the Emperor was not a god, but that gods did exist. They told him that the warp was not empty, that it was filled with vast, immortal intelligences that fed on emotion and desire, that these beings were older than humanity, older than the stars, and that they could grant power beyond imagining. They told him that the Emperor had lied. The Emperor had built the Imperium on the principle that the warp was a tool, that it could be understood and controlled. But the warp could not be controlled. It was alive, it was conscious, and it was hungry. The entities showed Lorgar visions. They showed him the future. They showed him the Imperium collapsing, the Emperor entombed, humanity scattered and broken. They showed him the truth of what the Emperor had been trying to build, a species free from the warp's influence, a species that could starve the gods by ceasing to feed them. And they offered Lorgar an alternative. Serve us, they said, and we will give you everything the Emperor denied you. Purpose, power, truth. Lorgar accepted. He returned to his legion and began the work of conversion, not conversion to the imperial truth, conversion to something older. He did this carefully, he did this slowly. He did not preach openly, he did not write new scriptures. He simply spoke in private to those he trusted. He planted seeds, he let them grow. Within 5 years, the word-bearers had become a cult. They still served the Imperium. They still conquered worlds. They still tithed and obeyed and functioned as they had always functioned. But they no longer believed in the Emperor. They believed in something else. And they were not alone. The corruption spread through channels that had always existed. The Imperium was vast. The Crusade had expanded too quickly for the Administratum to track every ship, every regiment, every officer. There were gaps. There were spaces where oversight was thin. The word-bearers used those spaces. They embedded chaplains into other legions. They distributed texts disguised as tactical manuals. They spoke in metaphor and suggestion, never stating outright what they believed, always letting the listener draw their own conclusions. The message was simple. You have been lied to. The Emperor is not what you think he is. There is power in the warp, and it can be yours. It worked because it was true. The Imperium had lied. The Emperor had lied. The warp was not a tool. It was not safe. It was not controllable. Every psyker bound into the Astronomicon knew this. Every navigator who had stared into the warp and seen things moving in the dark knew this. Every soldier who had fought on worlds where reality bent and broke knew this. But they had been told not to speak of it. The Imperium's greatest vulnerability was not its enemies. It was the truth. And once the truth began to spread, it could not be stopped. By the year 004.M31, half of the Legiones Astartes had been compromised. Not openly, not in ways that could be measured or detected, but the seeds had been planted, the doubts had been sown, the Imperium was rotting from within, and it did not know. The war began on the 13th day of 005.M31 in the Istvan system. The Emperor had sent 7 legions to suppress a rebellion on Istvan III. The rebellion was a fiction. The legions had been lured there. 4 of the 7 legions, the Word-Bearers, the World-Eaters, the Death Guard, and the Emperor's children, turned on the remaining 3. The loyalist legions were slaughtered. The survivors retreated to Istvan Fuf and called for reinforcements. 4 more legions arrived. The Iron Hands, the Salamanders, the Raven Guard, and the Alpha Legion. They descended to the surface and prepared to engage the traitors. And then the Iron Hands, the Salamanders, and the Raven Guard were fired upon by their own allies. The Alpha Legion had turned. The massacre lasted 6 hours. By the end, 3 legions had been nearly annihilated. The traitors controlled the system, and the Imperium, for the first time in its history, was at war with itself. This conflict would be called the Horus Heresy, named after the War Master who led the traitor forces. But the war was not Horus's creation. It was Lorgar's. Lorgar had spent years preparing for this moment. He had converted the legions. He had secured the support of the warp entities. He had ensured that when the moment came, the Imperium would tear itself apart. And it did.